And with the Black Lives Matter protests erupting around the world, and with everyone having a mobile phone ready to press record, it seems the magnifying glass is being focused on police now more than ever. There have been calls to reform, defund, or even abolish the force, but is Australia ready for that conversation? Journalist Osman Faruqi has written an opinion piece called "Policing is Part of the National Psyche" for the Saturday newspaper, and he joins us now. Welcome, Osman, to the Ben, Rob and Robbo Show.
Thanks for having me on. Really looking forward to the chat.
Me too. Look, Osman, I found your piece really insightful, and I agree with your take that crime and punishment has absolutely been used by politicians over the years to win elections. But what does the future of policing look like to you?
It's a really, really great question. And obviously, there's been this huge discussion around the world about exactly that. Like, what is a model that lets the community feel safe, but doesn't, end up with the current situation where we've seen in so much of the world, including here in Australia, where we've just invested more in policing and blown out the prison population without seeing, a reduction in actual crime rates associated with that. I think that the lessons from around the world is a move away from what people call punitive or carceral policing, which is all about, hitting quotas, getting people arrested, getting them through the court system, and getting them into prison, and more resources being put into, the root causes of what leads to crime, and looking at what are some of the other social services that we could be investing in that aren't just the police, that end up having the same impact, which is to reduce the level of crime and make the community feel safe.
Yes, and that's the big question here, isn't it? If we don't know where we're going, is our police are our police force an issue? There's obviously a big disconnect with what's happening in America. We don't have the same issues here. Obviously, the incarceration of Indigenous youths is an issue, but where are we heading? What do we need to do, and do we need to turn our back on the police force that we've currently got?
Yeah, I think, the comparison to America is interesting. I don't think you could say, when you're looking at the rates of, police killings in the States, that you could say that Australia has anything comparable to that. And that's not the point that I'm making at all. But in terms of the way that we rely on police to just run our society, in some instances we're worse. You mentioned the incarceration rate of Aboriginal people. There's a story in the Herald today that says that Aboriginal people are twice as likely to go to prison for the same crimes as non-Aboriginal people. And in some areas of the country, particularly in regional towns with high Indigenous populations, there's more police there per capita than some of the highest police places in America, places like New York, Chicago, and LA. So it's not, while we don't have the same level of, police violence and police killings as the States, as far as, the general presence of police and the way that is being used to target particular communities, in some instances, we're worse off. And I think that's something that we need to take a step back and look at, because the history for the last few years has been just more police. In Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland governments have committed to just putting more money into the police force. They're the only, public sector institutions that are exempt from, wage caps and efficiency dividends. And it's just not clear that that strategy is working.
Well, I'd say that some of those statistics are pretty harrowing, but look, Australia has always had a lot of our frontline workers who risk their lives, whether that's the police, fireys or doctors. Do you think, or do you worry that these kind of conversations may encourage disrespect towards them?
Yeah, look, that's a really fair question. And there is a risk in terms of how a conversation like this ends up playing out on the front lines. And I think the point that I would make is that the conversation and the focus shouldn't be on individual frontline workers, including police. It should be on the broader decisions being made around how we deal with these issues. It's obviously not an individual police officer's fault if they've been hired to do a particular job, or they're enforcing a particular law, or they've got a quota to meet. That's not on that individual. And I'm not calling on anyone to disrespect, frontline workers doing their jobs. The question is much more about government decision making and whether they've set the right framework. And I think if you speak to some police officers, and I've spoken to police officers, over the years in my reporting, and then even in the last couple of months, looking at the way that police have been used to deal with public health issues. And a lot of police officers aren't happy with being used that way. They don't feel like they've got the training or the protective equipment or the support from the community to do frontline healthcare work. So this isn't about pitting police officers against the community. It's about creating a model that works for everyone.
Now, this is the point, and this is the question, isn't it? What the model is, because we've all grown up with the police force and we learn to respect the police. And I do think, and I'll come back to it again, Australia is a very different situation to the US. The US, I do believe policing has been out of control. In Australia, we have some bad incidents, but I do believe on the whole, our police force is good. Is that a naive feeling?
Look, it depends on what you're trying to solve with this, right? And I think the issue around the model is like, let's think about, I think the way that most people's experience of how police operate and what their understanding of the way police work is through, the most severe kinds of crimes, right? Like most people would be watching, true crime is a genre that's so popular in Australia. And that's focused on the way police are used to stop really horrendous crimes like murders, sexual assaults, serial murders, that sort of stuff. But most policing doesn't work in that space. It works on much lower levels of crime. And what we've seen over the last few decades has been an expansion of policing into areas that are even more, I guess, what you'd call low-level areas of crime. And that's not normal. It's not actually the model from a lot of the world. We're seeing calls around the Anglosphere in particular that is based on a more kind of European model of policing, where people who've got mental health call-outs, for example, or low-level drug offences, that police aren't being used to deal with those offences. It's healthcare workers, it's social services. In Australia, we still rely on policing for that sort of stuff. And there's real question marks as to whether or not throwing someone in prison for a low-level drug crime, or even having police deal with people who are having a mental health episode, is the right way to deal with that. So there's two separate issues. There's one is, how do we keep the community safe from, violent crimes? And obviously, healthcare workers and social services aren't the way to deal with that. That's probably a space where police should be spending their resources and where the priority belongs. But for a whole raft of other incidents that are much more about just day-to-day social functioning, are police the right way to deal with that? I'm not sure that they are.
No, and I've got to agree with you there, Osman. I think you raised some very important points about what police should and shouldn't be attending. Let's talk now about something that you talk about in your articles, penal populism. What is that, and can you tell us more information?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating concept, and it was defined in the 1990s by criminologists who were looking at this phenomenon that only really started to appear in the 80s in America, and then in the 90s in countries like New Zealand and Australia. And it was essentially politicians who were trying to get re-elected using police and law and order as a tactic for that, basically. So even though the crime rates were stable or already declining, you saw politicians talk about particular incidents of crime that really worried the community. You saw politicians working quite closely with the media, particularly tabloid media, to create a sense of fear in the community that crime was out of control. And then politicians would say, oh, well, you're really worried about crime? Well, we've got the response for you. It's hiring more police officers. It's punishing people with mandatory sentencing. And the community, who were concerned by that level of crime, because it's what they were being told by their leaders, would then vote for those political parties. And it was pioneered by conservatives in the US, then adopted by conservatives in Australia. But now it's a bipartisan issue. You see both Labor and coalition parties beat the law and order drum, as it's called. And it's been a really defining part of Australian politics, particularly at a state level, since the mid-90s. And it's just, every election you will see both parties offer tougher laws, more resources for police, just as a way to, I guess, tap into that community concern.
Well, that's absolutely the thing. It is hard to have an adult conversation about these issues because there's politics involved. And as soon as a politician shows weakness on an issue like going soft on crime, they're pretty much dead in the water. But look, certainly a lot to talk about. Thank you very much. You can hear more of Osman's work on the 7 a.m. podcast. Osman, thank you so much for being on the Ben, Rob and Robbo show today.
Thanks so much, Ben, Rob and Robbo. And it was great to chat about this with you guys.
It's the Ben, Rob and Robbo, Ben, Rob and Robbo, Ben, Rob and Robbo show.